Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers? Hope you're having a good Wednesday so far. You know, I woke up thinking this was just going to be another day in the Wagner trial, and we would have a few defense witnesses on who probably would opt out, but boy, was I wrong. Okay, first off, when I said I would eat my shoe if George Wagner ever took the stand, I take that back because none other than George Wagner has been on the stand all day and on camera. Just crazy. Never would have thought that in a million years, but here we are. First, want to thank everybody who tuned into the live that we did Saturday night. Was it Saturday, Sunday night? I forgot what night. With Anjanette Levy, who was kind enough to join us, and Big E. It was so much fun. It was just like sitting around at a table with some coffee, talking to your friends about this case. And you guys seem to enjoy it. If you haven't watched it, it's on YouTube. Or if you prefer to listen, I've uploaded that to the podcast platforms. So big thanks to those two for coming in. And people said they learned stuff that they missed. So that's cool. That's what it's all about, right? Big thank you also to everybody who donated super chats and also to the donors from this week and over the weekend. I'm going to get that list together to thank you guys on the next episode tonight. This is going to be 2 parts. It is a lot. And I know a lot of you don't have time to watch all 8 hours. So I am taking pretty thorough notes to make sure you guys hear it all. So these are going to be longer episodes today, both of them. And that's why I'm doing 2. I didn't want to try to even attempt uploading an over 2-hour episode. So before we get started, check this out. Some of the songs that never topped the Billboard Top 40. Some of the songs: Blew Me Away, Highway to Hell by AC/DC, Changes by David Bowie, Should I Stay or Should I Go by The Clash, Tiny Dancer by Elton John. How did that not get on there? It's one of my favorites. Jolene by Dolly Parton. You Can't Always Get What You Want by the Rolling Stones, and 2 of my all-time favorites, Comfortably Numb by Pink Floyd and Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, never graced the top 40. Interesting. All right, so we're going to go over these 2 witnesses from yesterday. Thanks to Big E for getting me the notes on Bernard Brown, who opted out. He is the man that the Wagners stored their trailers on when they moved to Alaska. So he hauls livestock for a living all over the country 2 to 3 times a month. Back in 2014, 2015, just after the Wagners moved in, Mr. Brown got cancer. And so he needed some help. And he said the Wagners bought a truck off of him, and the Wagners did chores on his farm while he was sick. He knows all of the Wagners, and he said George was an all right guy, wasn't hostile, said he was a very hard worker and trustworthy. He said if George asked him for a job today, he would be glad to have him there. So George helped him do a lot of things, including servicing his truck and things like that. He helped him out for a year or a year and a half, and he's asked to identify George in the courtroom, and he points him out. He said Jake, on the other hand, was pleasant and helped on his farm as well. He knew they had sold their property at Peterson and had a deadline to be out. So the Wagners asked if they could store those trailers on his property. After the move, when the Wagners moved out, authorities contacted his wife, whose name is Bonnie, to let her know they were going to be conducting this search warrant on those trailers, which were on his property. They told him to stay away from the area, and he said they were there about 12 hours total. They left things laid out everywhere, and he said it was raining. He tried to clean up a bit around those trailers, and he did have contact with the Wagners when they moved back from Alaska. He said Jake and George both were a pleasure to deal with, and all the time he knew them, he never heard so much as a swear word come out of their mouth. So the next witness yesterday who opted in was Alex Staley. Now, he is the separated husband of Samantha, who testified. If you remember, she was the one that dated Frankie for a few years in middle and high school. And I really do think maybe had a crush on George. He was familiar with the Roden family, but George came to help with their car when it was having problems. Samantha called George because her husband couldn't get it fixed. He said they talked about things a country boy would talk about: trucks, cars, four-wheelers. He visited George at Peterson Road because they were having issues with another car of theirs. He said he hung out with him some once George came over and just sat and they talked for a while. And he said another time they went fishing at Lake White with Samantha. That was about 2 weeks after the murders, and she testified to that. He said they were talking about the murders to an extent and how bad it was. There was an objection, but he said he knew George was friends with Frankie, and George's demeanor was sad and he teared up. The conversation stopped not long after that, and he said he considered George a friend. So on cross, essentially, Prosecutor Canepa just downplayed how well he knew George. She really didn't know him. He said he knew him for 5 years, and she asked if that was before the arrest or after, and he said it was just total years that he's known him. So just barely right before the arrest. She asked if he hung with George a lot or a handful of times, and he said they would talk for a few hours when they were done working on their cars. He had met Billy, but none of the other Wagners or the children. He did know Frankie through Samantha, but didn't really interact with him much at all. So that takes us to today, the big witness, who is still on the stand, by the way. I stopped watching after lunch, finished up these notes to go ahead and get this episode in. I don't know where we're at in the testimony, but okay, I'm going to put this out there, and out of the gate, I want to make very clear. I do 100% believe George was involved in the conspiracy, no doubt. I think that's been proven. I don't think there's any reason for me to doubt that. With Jake and Angela both testifying, if he wasn't a part of it, it would have been very easy for them to say he wasn't a part of it. And then they still get their sentences, but they took a plea. And part of that plea is they are going to testify against George. What they did, George could have stopped these murders. George could have gotten out of the truck when Billy pulled over before they went to Chris Sr.'s. So I have no sympathy for George, but I will say this may be the best thing the defense has done so far for their case for any chance whatsoever, because you're putting the jury in a position of this. Jake was very cold and calculated on the stand. He smiled at inappropriate times. That's going to rub the jury the wrong way, regardless of if it's a nervous tick or just how he does things. Angela, it's not hard to know what kind of person Angela is after hearing the wiretaps, and the same with George. That way too. But this jury is going to be listening probably for the rest of the day and part of tomorrow to George Wagner talk. And I will tell you right now, he comes across to me as very sincere. He shows very muted emotional responses to things, but they are there, even just in how his eyes look at times, especially when he was talking about Hannah Mae, how he looked at her like a little sister. But I think what this shows is that the version of George that we heard on the wiretaps and the version of George that we were told about by Jake and Angela is very different than who we're seeing today. Now, he's on his best behavior, obviously, because he's on the stand. But I will say this, my impression of George right now, guilty of conspiracy from what I've witnessed during this trial, or the notes I've gotten, because we didn't get to hear Jake or Angela. But I will say, I think it is very sad that George was clearly the product of a very messed up environment, because I do see he comes across as somebody who had the potential to be a really good human, a really good father. I don't understand how this family had this hold on him. I really, really don't, because he comes across as believable. And so it's going to be interesting to see what this jury does. Are they going to kind of feel sorry for George now? Because I'm going to tell you, my Twitter and my Facebook, while people obviously recognize his role in the homicides, at the same time, more people today than ever have said, I feel sorry for the guy. Not in a sense of the murders or he's going to prison, but more of just that he never had the chance. He was never nurtured to be the level of person I think he could have been. Really, it it's like if you were to take away what we know about the murders and I saw him talk, I would think he seems like a nice guy. It's really bizarre to feel that way. You feel a little guilty for feeling that way, but at the same time, it's human emotion. And that's what this jury is going to have to sort in their brains now is, I still think the defense would have been way better to say, my life was threatened if I did not go, and you fight it from there. But they're going with the oblivious unless something's changed after lunch I don't know about. He's still on direct as far as I know. So they start off by showing George a photo of him taken in 2018 of when he had his feet measured at BCI. He is 6 foot tall. And he said at the time of the photo, he probably was about 280 pounds. He said over his entire life, he spent most of it being overweight. He said he hasn't been under 259 since he was maybe 13. And at the peak from 21 up until I would say about a year after the arrest, when he really dropped a lot of weight behind bars, he said he averaged 280 to 300, maybe 315. So a big guy. He said he had not been the size he is currently in many years. They show him a photo of Billy. He says Billy is 6'6". And at the time of the murders, he said that they asked about Billy's weight, and he said he doesn't know now because we know he hasn't seen his dad. But at the time of the murders, George himself was 30 to 40 pounds heavier than what he is now. He was born in Lucasville, Ohio, and so they started off talking about the Bethel Hill house. When he was a year old, they moved there and stayed until he was 23. So for school, he did go to public school, as we know, for a very, very short amount of time, a few weeks, maybe, he said. Angela ended up homeschooling both him and Jake, as we know, and he and Jake are 1 year and 1 month apart. They get into Tabby. She's 4 months younger than Jake, so a year and a half younger than George. So for homeschooling in the morning, Angela would teach them until around noon. He had a desk in his room, and he said he didn't have any subjects that he liked or disliked mostly, but he was kind of pressed on that. And he said he did enjoy math and history. He said Billy was the one who taught history because he loved history. He progressed through school, but quit at the age of 14. He wanted to do his own thing. He said Billy had also quit in the 6th grade. George said when he was younger, he wanted to be a game warden, but as he got older, Billy pushed him to be a diesel mechanic or a truck driver. Billy did not want his boys wearing the badge, as George says. He said that all cops are crooked, and he taught them that from a very young age. He had a good relationship with Billy when he was younger. He said he used to take him fishing on the weekends, taught him to drive a car, hunt, and they would actually sometimes hunt daily on the Flying W farm property. He said Flying W is around 3,000 acres, and the Bethel Hill house technically is on the Flying W property. His grandfather was the one who started the farm. George is named after him, as well as Billy. George said it got complicated with bills and debts and things like that because they would get the George Wagners messed up. We saw that in the trial, actually, when we had the financial guy on the stand, and he said one account was George's when actually it was George Wagner the third and not the fourth, and it was Billy's account. He said he actually did not name Bullvine George for that very reason. So back to when they were in school, after the noon time was over, it was farm work or whatever Angela wanted done. He said they had horses, cows, ducks, chicken, geese, dogs. His responsibilities were to feed and water the animals, clean their pens out, carry water from the pond. He said they had a lot of chickens, 30 to 40 usually. They were Angela's hobby. Horses, they would have 4 to 5, sometimes up to 15 or 20. The same with cows and pigs. Sometimes they had between 80 and 90 pigs on their farm. They got the animals from Billy. He would buy them and then resell them when the prices went up. So daily, he would clean stalls, move around animals from pen to pen, move cows to different pastures on the property. In all, it took about 5 to 6 hours a day to do his chores. He said he had to help Jake because Jake was just slower. So he talks about Billy teaching him to steal tractor trailer loads, lockpick, and steal fuel. The lockpick started around age 13, and he bought this lockpick set for the boys to practice on. He said his dad would sit them down for hours until they could figure it out. So once Jake, as we know, became very good at it, Billy would have Jake do the picking on vending machines so they could open the cash box and the coin box. He said Jake could open a lock in 3 to 4 seconds. George, he said about 3 to 4 minutes. So he said they would unlock these things in the middle of the day. Around the age of 14, Billy started taking George and Jake to break into tractor trailers. So they would go from truck stop to truck stop. And Billy would target Walmart trucks because George said Billy hates Walmart. And he said, I don't know why. Angela was with them when they did this, by the way. He said pretty much all the time she was in there. So he explained with the tractor trailers how they did it. You would take the hinge off without breaking the seal on the back of the truck. So if it was something they didn't want, then the trucker never knew somebody had been in the truck. And you would then put that hinge back on. So every weekend they would steal diesel fuel through the ground holes with a 12-volt system at truck stops. He said they're padlocked. So Jake would pick the lock and they would drop a hose in and pump the fuel out of it. They had a 500-gallon tank in a trailer they would pull to go do this. Wow. I mean, it's just very, they had it all down pat. Once they got the fuel, Billy would actually go to different trucking companies and sell it at half price because it's diesel. It's always higher. When asked why diesel, and George said because gas explodes and diesel doesn't. They stored the tank in the trailer, and sometimes it would go into a 2,000-gallon tank on Bethel Hill. He said on that property, they actually had the storage capacity of 20,000 gallons, but they usually kept 1,000 gallons, and it was mainly for personal use. And he said the reason they all drove diesel was because of the free fuel. So as a kid, George liked a Dodge because of the engine, and he got a common diesel tattoo on his right shoulder. Parker asked if that's common in the area to get that tattoo, and George said it's common until people grow common sense. So I really can't wait to hear from Anjanette about the jury, how they're responding to this testimony. You can really tell if they're buying it or not, just in body language. If I would have known he was going to take the stand today, y'all, I would so be in Ohio today. I'm not even kidding. So Billy taught George to be a lookout. You know, he would say, make sure you see a cop before they saw you. Know where every camera is. When George was little, they would get $1 for every cop that they spotted while out. He said that goes way back to when he was 8 years old, and they stopped doing it when he was around 10 or 11. Billy would go around and start down one street, and if the boys missed a camera that George saw, they would lose their four-wheeler for a week. So, I mean, he's just embedding in their brains how to avoid, how to go undetected, which clearly benefited them the night of the Roden and Gilly murders. So they had, let's see here, four-wheelers. That's a big thing with George. He said they had 5 or 6 of them on the farm at all times, and they would use them for hunting or fishing, or he said playing four-wheel tag. So if you bump into somebody, they're it, and then they chase you. He said they took those four-wheelers all over the place and had certain paths they made to use them on. Jake didn't go as much, and if he did, he was always way slower. He said he mainly rode four-wheelers with Chris Newcomb, and that Chris is more like a brother and a role model. And he said best friend just wouldn't cut it. They were just more than that. They're almost identical in their hobbies, and Chris is only 1.5 years older than him. So they would spend sometimes days, weeks at each other's houses as kids. They would go mudding, hunting, fishing. He said sometimes we would just see how far we could go on our four-wheeler in a day. Jake came, but in his own way. He went slow and did not want to get the four-wheeler dirty, so oftentimes he got left behind. Him and Chris were like, he said, a bat out of hell on those four-wheelers. He was asked about growing up with Jake. He said Jake watched cartoons, played a lot of video games, and collected action figures. He had hundreds of those, and he would set them up on a shelf and stare at them for hours, according to George. So George would go in and move them like a centimeter and when Jake wasn't there, but when Jake noticed, and he said he always noticed, it would often cause big fights. Very OCD. I'm sure he's got OCD. I mean, sounds like he has some issues with things being just right. Jake liked to play Marvel Universe video games, Resident Evil, which is like a zombie game, Left 4 Dead, which is another zombie game. I've played both of those. They're fun to play. And he said overall, Jake just loves zombies. He would do that while George and Chris were out doing their outside thing. So when they got older, George said that him and Chris would drink and party and run girls. He started drinking around the age of 12 or 13 and started partying mainly when he got his driver's license. And he said that was in October of 2007 and he was 16 at the time. He would drink with Chris Newcomb, some friends. And when he got older, he drank a lot with Frankie Roden. He knew Hannah Mae through Jake, but didn't know Frankie and Hannah Mae were brother and sister at the time. When asked how he met Frankie, he said it's a complicated situation. Frankie texted him one morning around 5 a.m. cussing him out, and he was around 18. George was around 18 at that time. They never really said what he was cussing him out about unless I missed it, but he said they met that morning and became friends. They would hunt and fish that first summer almost daily. They went to each other's houses. Neither Frankie nor George had kids at the time, and he said he considered Frankie one of his best friends. George said he only had a handful of friends until he got his driver's license. He didn't have much social activity outside the house. Most of them at that time were kids of Billy's friends when he was younger, before he could drive, that he hung out with, other than Jake and Chris. He said once he had his driver's license, of course, that gave him the freedom to leave. So he would leave every day and hang out with Frankie or Chris Newcomb. They'd go to fall festivals, fairs, hunting, fishing. Angela did not like it. She said Jake was left to do all the work. And when asked if he did leave Jake with all the work, he said he did because he wanted to go hunt, party, and fish with all of his friends. Billy didn't care about the farm work that George wasn't doing. All he cared about was George being available for the weekends to steal fuel and trailers. So he said getting his driver's license broadened his life a lot. He was able to be more mobile. He got to go see and do more things. He had his own truck that was bought by Billy. It was a 79 Chevy truck for $2,500. Jake actually got a truck 3 to 4 months before him, and Jake had always wanted a truck with a Cummins in it, and back then it was unheard of. So they were driving through Kentucky, and Jake said he saw his dream truck over the bank, and nobody believed him. So Billy turns around, and the truck was there. He said Angela made Billy buy that truck for him. It was $16,000, and George was a month away from getting his permit and didn't even have a truck yet. So George got his truck 2 to 3 months after Jake got his. George says he was told no for a truck that was the same price as Jake's. And he said he's brought that up his whole life, and he admitted that to this day, it is still a sore spot, and he's still bitter about it. So he talked about Jake's truck, and he said Jake left it under a carport and washed and waxed it every day, and nobody could touch it. It had to stay spotless. You had to sit on plastic in his truck, or you couldn't eat or drink in it or anything. Very particular. George said his truck was a typical Southern Ohio boy's truck, covered in mud, lots of trash, beer cans. And he started hanging out at Big Bear Lake with Frankie. And the first time he went, some girl Frankie knew had a big birthday party. He said he spent a lot of time at Big Bear Lake with Frankie, and George was around 18 or 19 at this time. They would ride ATVs, drink, and he said they would go to the gas station for more beer runs and sit around a campfire all night and play drinking games. Then they would just tent out in this big tent George had. It was a Jeep tent that had 3 rooms. He said it was big. You could stand in it. And they actually stayed in the yard of the man who owned the lake, and Frankie called him his uncle. So George said they would drink until they fell out, which he kind of grinned and said was usually him first. The group consisted of about 6 to 15 people at any random time. He made friends with a guy named Brett and Chelsea Robinson, who was Frankie Roden's ex and also the mother of his first child. The rest were just people who were there, and it did cause problems with Angela because she thought it was a bad environment, bad influences, and that he was setting himself up for hell. She would tell him this daily. Billy didn't care as long as he didn't drink and drive, and George said he never once has drank and driven a car. Jake would go sometimes to Big Bear Lake, but he would stay in the tent with Hannah Mae, and he wouldn't let Hannah Mae drink. She would try to hang out, but Jake didn't want bad influences around her either. So the regulars that he went with and interacted with were the guy named Brett, Frankie, Chelsea, and George. And for about 2 years, they were on and off going there on a regular basis. So they moved to talk about the house at Bethel Hill. And that first house was a single wide trailer until he was around 6. Angela tried to burn that one down, but it failed. They had the house closed off, so there was no oxygen after a while, and only the kitchen and the living room burned. He said she didn't know what she was doing, and Frederica paid to remodel it, and Angela had told her it was an accident. So they built onto that and added another single wide, and he said it kind of made just this giant L shape. They lived there until 2000, until they burnt that one down successfully. George was around 9 at the time, and Angela and Billy succeeded. He said they stuck newspapers under the fuse box. Frederica bought them a new single wide after that one burned, and they stayed in that for a year. Billy extended the driveway and moved it like a half a mile back off the property, and then they added on to that one. Billy and Angela added several more rooms, and George said he called it the Kentucky Wonder Mansion. He said they actually finished building on when he was 14 or so in about 2005. He remembers dimensions. He said that one addition was 12 foot by 80, and then another add-on was 10 foot by 80. He said he had his own mudroom and exit door. It was almost like an apartment, but he did share a bathroom and a kitchen. He liked having his own exit so people didn't know if he left in the middle of the night. And so he said he liked that. He would go hunting or fishing. He kept all of his hunting stuff in his room, and he said he would hunt all day, every day. Angela was running the dog breeding business at that time, and she expected Jake and George to work 8 to 10 hours a day, not pay them. So George said as soon as she turned her back, he would just take off and leave. Sometimes he would hang out with Chris Newcomb or another friend, and a lot of times he would just go hunting or fishing alone. He said he'd go sit alone in the woods, and he also had access to all the neighboring farms around them. So Angela would throw huge fits that he left Jake alone with the work, and at that time, it was taking care of the dogs. So he said they had between 80 and 100 dogs on their property at one point. So they were expected to clean the pens, move one male to another pen, and take pictures to sell these dogs. And George said he just stayed gone as much as he could, but Jake stayed behind and always did what Angela wanted. So for the dog breeding business, he said in the beginning, they bred English bulldogs and Labrador retrievers. They would advertise in the newspaper. He said at that point, there wasn't Facebook or Craigslist, so they kind of did it the old fashioned way. He said at that time, she sold a lot and made a lot of money doing that. He said the English bulldogs were legitimate. For the labs, if one of the females had 8 pups, she would go to the pound and try to find some that looked like those puppies. And if they had a little imperfection where maybe a little spot on their fur, she would actually dye the hair to mask it, to make it look like it belonged in that litter. Later on, she raised Yorkies, I think he said Maltese, and Labradoodles. She had 80 to 100 dogs in 4 buildings, and he said they were stuffed full. That's just so mean. That's just puppy mill stuff. She did the same thing with the pound, and she would take those breed of dogs, pass them off, saying that she hadn't sold the original litter yet, and would pass these dogs off as if they were one of the original 8 that were born. He said the dog business went on until it burned down. They came home from Columbus, Ohio one night, and the kennels were in ashes. They never found out how it burned. She started again a few years later while they were still on Bethel Hill Road. That's so sad. You think about all those poor dogs that died. And I mean, according to George, they were all gone. They don't know how it started. George had a female beagle, and Angela brought a male in. She said they were pocket beagles, but George said there's no such thing as pocket beagles. He talked about a dog, Rover, that followed him home one day, And he caught him. He tried for 3 days to catch this dog and finally caught him in a coon trap. He said he was an ill-tempered stray dog, but the dog dug up a yellow jacket's nest and about died. So did my dog at one time too, y'all. I put that dog in the Jeep and his cheeks were this big and there were like 50 yellow jackets flying as I'm going down the road. Never forget that day. But George's dog went into a coma. So George said he nursed him back to health. And after that day, he stayed by George's side. He said he would follow him everywhere. And that was when George was around 15. Ultimately, he said Rover got eaten by a coyote. He said that several times he had been attacked by a coyote and he would take him and have him stitched up. But one time he just never came back. So he assumed that's what happened. They had many coyotes on the farm, but Frederica would not let them shoot them. So, of course, they multiplied and they were all over. The Wonder Mansion, as he called it, burned in late 2007 or 2008. He was around 16 or 17 at that time. So in August of 2007, the Wagners took that trip to Alaska early on to visit the Cinereskis, which are the two pastors, if you remember, that testified last week. They were from Memphis, and they visited for a week. They went to visit them. So George loved it there. He said he didn't want to come home. And he said Alaska is the most beautiful place there is. Chris and Rita watched the house while they were gone. And so the Wagners decided they were going to move around that time. So we're talking way before these murders. But here's what they did. Angela and Billy burned down the house so they could move. But after the arson, Billy decided not to leave. He didn't want to leave the farm, so they rebuilt. A company framed the house and put the roof on and the basement. Jake, Angela, and George finished the house, and he said Angela finishing, meaning she played foreman, while he and Jake did all the work. They did all the wiring, the floors, the insulation, the trim. The basement wasn't finished. They mainly used it for storage. And Billy and Chris Sr. built on a 10 by 40 room to grow marijuana in. He said Billy did grow in the field before the pine trees, or kind of in the pine trees on the Bethel Hill property. But his mom hired a company from Georgia to trim the pine trees. So his grandpa had to cut all the stuff down early. He knew about the Rocky boots. Remember, Angela and Billy were arrested for that. Angela helped plan that little heist as well, and a couple of other people that Billy drove with. They had their choice of taking a trailer of boots or diapers. Angela wanted the diapers. Billy and the friends wanted the boots. So they came to the house and all of them unloaded those boots into the basement at Bethel Hill. Then it was divided 3 ways. He said there were thousands of pairs, and he kind of smiles and said everyone in Pike County was wearing Rocky boots at that point, which I thought was kind of funny. I think I heard a couple of little snickers too. So when asked if he knew about other thefts, he said, well, how many do you want me to go through? I could go for days. So he was asked about the hot tubs. So Billy and a friend stole a trailer full of hot tubs from a truck stop in Waverly, and they got a hot tub out of it, and then they split with the other people who they stole it with. All the Wagners went around selling hot tubs to everybody. He said there were many others. There was one, a trailer from a truck stop. It wasn't a full load, but it had Dell laptops in it. All 4 Wagners unloaded that, and they went around selling laptops. Billy used to say he buried money all across the USA at different stops. He would steal copper and aluminum and take it to Mexico to sell. George said Billy told him there was money buried between Ohio to Texas. He would come home from those Mexico trips with brown paper bags full of money between $100,000 to $200,000. And it just depended on scrap prices at the time. But he said him and Jake were the ones who counted the money, and George was 15 at the time that they were counting the money. He said his dad missed Christmas actually that year from taking a load down to Mexico. He thinks that Billy went to Mexico around 4 times total. There was a little short break here. And then after the break, the defense asked about the lake with the goose box where they buried the weapons with concrete. He said, we'll get to that later. Then he said he's familiar with Crystal Springs, which is that group home of Frederica's that's on her property. It's just on a hill near the lake. It's called an MMRD home, and he said it's for adults who are still children in their own brain. George did get a diploma, but get this, y'all. It's not going to be the way you think. He said Angela did not want him to get his GED like Billy or Chris Newcomb. So what did Angela do? She took the test for George. When he was younger, Billy worked for his grandparents, buying horses, worked for Frederica and his dad, buying horses, cows, and junk. After the dog kennels burned, Billy got a CDL and a friend hired him, so he started driving a truck. George started noticing changes in Billy around this time. He said Billy has the habit of kind of taking on the personality of whoever is his father figure at the time. And George said Billy has daddy issues. When he started driving a truck, he noticed the guy Billy was driving with took pills to stay awake. So before you know it, he said Billy's taking handfuls of Adipex and pain pills in the mornings, and it made Billy very hard to be around. He was super irritable. And he said Billy's hard of hearing, so when he's not paying attention to you, you would have to yell to get his attention. But after he started taking these pills, if you yelled to get his attention, he just assumed you were yelling, and it caused huge arguments. Once Billy was trucking and taking the pills, they didn't spend much time together anymore because he was always in a bad mood. And he said they had more fights than he can remember. George said when he was 16, Jake ran him over with a truck while hooking up a trailer. And George started yelling at Jake, and Billy took it out on him and not Jake. George wasn't hurt. He said he was just bruised, but Billy thought he was just yelling at Jake for no reason. So Billy pushed him up against a truck and started yelling at him and dared George to hit him. So George hit him. Billy went to the ground. He said his dad got up and they got into a fist fight for about 5 minutes until Angela came out and broke it up. He said him and his dad didn't speak for a few weeks after that. They had 2 more fist fights that he can remember and one really huge argument. So the verbal argument was on Bethel Hill. The second fist fight was when George was in his late teens. He said Billy was insulting him, calling him dumb and ignorant, and George hit him, and they fought for 5 minutes and didn't talk for about 4 weeks after that one. The last fight they had was at Flying W in early 2016. After they moved from Bethel Hill to Peterson, Frederica had leased the Bethel Hill property to some deer hunters. And George was still in the process of moving their stuff from Bethel Hill to Peterson. He said they already lived at Peterson. It literally took them a couple of years to get all their stuff moved over to the new location. George said he didn't get along with the man who was leasing the property, and the man told George he was going to have him arrested for trespassing if he kept coming onto that property. So George wanted his grandma to tell this leaser guy that he's only leasing the property for hunting, and George could go there to get his stuff. But he said it didn't get that far. Billy asked George what he was doing up there that day. George told him he wanted Frederica to do something about this man. So Billy started yelling at George, saying he was going to get the lease canceled and was causing problems, and George would be the reason Frederica lost money. So George got upset and said he was leaving anyway, and he would just handle it by himself. So Billy came and punched through the passenger side window. He said it shattered all over him, and he was hit with glass. And then George explained that he kept an AR-15 on the dash in his truck when he was going to Flying W in case he saw a deer. So he had just recently bought it, but Billy grabbed that rifle and slung it across the yard into the dog pen. So they started fighting. Billy tried to tie George up. He said he used a lasso and it tightened around his neck. And George said he pulled it off, and he said he jerked Billy off of his feet with that. He said not to go into any detail, but Billy lost, and they didn't talk for 2 months after that one. He never moved in with them at Peterson. He was at the Flying W mainly. He just couldn't stand to be around Angela anymore. And also, as we know, his father was bedridden. So he moved in there to help with his dad. He said at the time, Billy and Angela's relationship was like friends after a divorce, even though they weren't divorced. He would come visit the grandkids. But they go into when he met Tabitha. So this is back to when they were kids. At Bethel Hill, there was a time when he met Tabby. George's Aunt Robin set it up, and George said Robin has lived on the farms all of her life. She initially wanted George to meet Tabby's sister Trish and Jake to meet Tabby. Robin thought the girls were great and would be a great match for George, who was 12, and Tabby was 11. A little young to be setting kids up. George said Tabby ended up going with him that day. They went fishing and four-wheeling and then back to his house. So a few weeks they consistently hung out, and then Tabby and Trish started staying there for weeks at a time because Tess, which is Tabby's mom, she worked at Crystal Springs, which is that group home. So Trish and Tabby took Jake's bedroom at night, and George and Jake would sleep in George's room. But after a few months of them living there or staying frequently, Trish did not want to stay anymore. So Angela made Tabby give Jake his room back, and Angela made her sleep on the couch, but she didn't want to sleep on the couch. So George offered to sleep on the couch and let her have his bed. Angela said, nope, you're not sleeping on the couch. Billy said, let Tabby sleep with George in his room. Can't even, y'all. He was 13 at the time, just when that testosterone's pumping through those veins. What a terrible idea. They did this for weeks at a time, and they were girlfriend and boyfriend at that point. So while she was living there when she was younger, they did a lot of outdoor stuff. And he said Billy would buy chickens, and every year they would sell them. So George and Tabby would go shoot about 10 to 15 at a time. He said one time him and Tabby got overexcited and shot 80 to 100 of them, and they also had to pluck the feathers. So a year later, George broke up with Tabby. He liked another girl. And he wasn't having any luck with this other girl, so he called Tabby back, and they dated for 4 to 5 months. And again, he broke up with her to pursue the same girl. At that point, they were apart for a few years. So George said when he turned 16 and got his driver's license, he was just partying and hanging out with friends. He said he first met Hannah Mae helping her get a canoe out of Big Bear Lake. He said he was around 18 at the time. She had not started dating Jake at this point. This was about 3 to 4 months before her and Jake started dating. So he recounts the story of how Hannah Mae and Jake met at the Pike County Fair. She was chasing him around with the rabbit. Jake was 17 and a half at the time, and Hannah Mae was 13. So after they left the fair, Jake went home, and George and Frankie went somewhere else. When George got home, Hannah Mae was texting Jake. He said that he looked at Hannah Mae as a baby sister. And he said Jake may be biologically his brother, but they never acted like brothers. Hannah Mae was just a baby sister to him, and Chris Newcomb was more like a brother than an uncle. He said that him and Hannah Mae would go fishing and four-wheeling, and they would fix buckeyes during the holidays. It's a food. I've never heard of that. I think I have a lucky buckeye of my great-grandfather's, but I didn't know you could eat buckeyes. She was living with them at that time, and he said they would tell dirty jokes back and forth, and they talked to each other about if they were having troubles in their personal lives. He said he would also put beers in different containers so Jake wouldn't know she was drinking beer. Jake did not like how close they were. He said George was too close to her, but George said it was never more than a little sister, big brother relationship. It's really hard to hear this, y'all, because knowing what he allowed to happen, you do see when he talked about Hannah Mae, there was some fond memories there, you could tell. He did smile. And then a couple of times after he would finish speaking, he would look down, and to me, he looked very emotional. So it's just really kind of that both hand thing, on one hand, he didn't stop her murder or the murder of 6 of her family members or Hannah Hazel. It's just, it's really, I don't even know how to describe it, guys. It's because I do feel like sincerely George, the way he came across, at least, cared for Hannah Mae. But still, this is, you can care for somebody all day long, but when you don't protect the people you care about, says a lot about you. So he said growing up with Jake on Bethel Hill, they were normal kids, did farm chores, watched TV, normal stuff. And at some point, Angela started convincing Jake that he was doing things in her mind that he shouldn't be. So she would tell Jake either he was going to hell or he would make Jesus cry. And Jake eventually just got really, really paranoid about going to hell. So if you cursed or anything he said she deemed inappropriate, she would say, "You're going down a bad road." George said he didn't have any reaction to that kind of stuff when she said it. George said he did what he wanted to do, but he said Jake was absolutely terrified of going to hell. At this point, they were nothing alike. In their teens, George spent as much time away from Jake as he could. They got along a few days out of the week, but he said there were more bad than good days. He said Jake is rude. He has no filter and he thinks he's better than everybody. So if Jake went into a house that was dirty, he would tell people your house is filthy. If he thought someone smelled bad, he would tell them they stink, go take a shower. He said that caused problems because he would insult people. And this would cause George's friends not to want to hang out with Jake. So he would leave Jake behind 90% of the time when he went with his friends. Jake thinks he's a saint and can do no wrong. And he thinks being honest is what people want to hear. But he said Angela always told him, George, that he should try to be more like Jake. She would tell George he's going to hell like her brother Chris was. And Angela would try to keep George from hanging out with Chris Newcomb, but once he got his license, he said, I was always with him. He said one night he was hanging out with Frankie at Big Bear Lake, and George went on a beer run at the Briar Patch. He said that was a gas station. He stopped on his four-wheeler and picked up Tabby. They went back to the lake, and around this time, George was 19 and Tabby was 18. They got engaged in Cedar Keys, Florida with Angela, George, Hannah Mae, Jake, and Tabby. George said they were there because a friend of his runs a hunting outfit there. So he asked her to marry him, and she said yes, and he said it was on July 1st of 2011. That's actually my daughter's birthday to the very, very day. He said it was a happy day, and they got married a year to the day, and he started laughing. He said that way there was no chance of him forgetting their wedding anniversary. They got married at the church on the farm, and he said the wedding was an absolute catastrophe. Things didn't arrive that were supposed to be there. Storm came through, the power went out, the music was mixed up, but he said it was a happy, happy night for him. And as we know, Kelly Cinereski married them. He first met them as a kid around the age of 11 or 12. And his dad stopped at a yard sale there, and the pastor invited them to come to visit that church. So they started attending every Sunday and some on Wednesdays, and it was the whole family. He said they went there for several years. He said after they got married, they were no different. George got her a job at the group home on his grandma's property. And he said since Tabby didn't have a driver's license, that was one of the only places that she could work without one. So Tabby lived with George on Bethel Hill before they got married. This was back in 2011. He said Tabby had bad fits. She would freak out, yell, and scream. And she had been doing that since she was a kid. But when she was a kid, she would cry and rock back and forth. And he said that would happen 2 to 3 times a week. And George said he would try and calm her down by hugging her, and that usually worked. You could see, for me personally, I could see some sadness in George's eyes when he was recalling this. You could tell this was hard for him to put into words on the stand, I thought. As an adult, she progressed to throwing things, and sometimes a hug didn't work. She's supposed to be on medications, but didn't take them. And they had a lot of really good days until her fits, and she would throw stuff at him and also bite him. So defense attorney Parker asked, did you know this before marrying her? Then why did you marry her? And he said, well, technically it's not her fault. She had a rough life. He thought he could help her. They tried for over a year to have a child. And finally she got pregnant with Bulvine. He said that was the best moment of his life. And after the birth, it was kind of up and down. A few months after she got pregnant, she called him and said her doctor called to inform her that she had an STD. And Tabby told him it could lay dormant for years. And George said, like an idiot, I believed it. So they gave her medication and it went away. But a couple of months before Bulvine was born, they were in Michigan. And again, her doctor called saying she had this a second time. George said, I was dumb the first time, but not the second. So Tabitha admitted she was having an affair with her best friend's dad. We heard her testify to that. He said he was heartbroken, but she said the baby was his, and they kind of went on with life up until the birth. He said that while she was in the hospital, he tried breaking it off with Tabby, and she cried and begged, saying she couldn't raise this baby alone, so he stayed. He said the day Vine was born, it was so nice to have a son, but it was hard not knowing whether or not it was his. So a DNA test was performed, and it was confirmed to be his child. They were still living at Bethel at this point, and George was working for himself. So George went to school to be a diesel mechanic, and it takes about a year to go through that program. But with it, you also get your CDL, and then you're able to drive trucks. So he took the course with Jake, and George said he really loved that course. After school, he got a job at a collision shop, and he was a mechanic and stayed there about 6 months. He enjoyed it, but he said he was on call and got overtime. His breaking point was after a 16-hour day of working, being called out to adjust a seat for a driver. He said things like that got annoying, so he got a job driving for a logging company and then a few other driving jobs. So September 2013, they were getting ready to move from Bethel over to Peterson. When asked why, George laughs and says he's heard multiple stories of why they were moving. He said it wasn't his choice. Billy had told them Frederica said she was selling the place, but Frederica said, not true, I'm just leasing it. But they had to find a new place, and Angela didn't want to leave the house for somebody else to live in. So what does she do? Burns it to the ground. And he said this was all her idea. And at this point, George was in his early 20s. If you remember, Tabitha testified that her and Angela got the receipt book, or Angela bought the receipt book. They made out receipts for things that were in the house that weren't in the house to turn into insurance to get reimbursed. So he said, I knew the house was going to be burned. He didn't want it to happen, but he said they were going to do it anyway. And he said he and Tabby got all their stuff and moved it to a second house that they had built on that Bethel property. That one burned in August of 2013. But George was working on his car when it caught fire. He said Jake was inside and used a chicken and grease to start the fire. And when it started, Chris Sr. was on the phone with 911, acting like he was trying to pull Jake from the house, but Jake was actually standing under the carport. George said he knew it was happening, but he didn't know it was happening that day. He was actually at the apartment, which is about 70 feet from that main house. And George said he thought, well, they're burning down the house. They looked at different places, and George found a place he really loved in Kentucky. Angela didn't approve, though. She said the neighborhood wasn't what she wanted. And he said, I know I mentioned it before, but Mom and Jake think they're better than everybody. So they looked at other places, one in Maysville, Kentucky. It was a big house that had 3 barns and 150 acres. And Billy really wanted that house and jumped way ahead of himself. George said Billy acted like a big shot, which he was not. And he offered a $50,000 non-refundable down deposit on it. So the defense asked to explain that, and George says, my father likes to act like something he's not. They were going to buy it, but Jake and George could not get the loan. So Billy paid the $50,000 thinking that the bank would approve their loan, and Billy lost every penny of that. After they found the Peterson home, it was in George and Jake's name, as we know. He said a couple of reasons they put it in their name is, number one, when they die one day, it goes to them, and there's not a lot of paperwork involved for them. And also, if they needed to get a loan, they could use the house for collateral. He said they used money from the insurance payout for Bethel, but also had to borrow the $30,000 from Frederica because Billy lost that $50,000. The defense says it's in your name, but whose house was that? And George said it was Mom's house, and she ran it. So Peterson, we know Hannah Mae, Tabby, Jake, Angela, Vine, and Sophia moved in. Billy would come over just a couple of times a week to see the kids. And George kind of smiled as he thought of this. He said Billy would bring the kids donuts to get everyone's wishes. And Billy didn't stay overnight, except for when Vine didn't want him to leave. But mainly he stayed at the Flying W. He said at that point, Angela and Billy might as well been divorced. They fought and argued, never got along. So he's asked about living at Peterson and if they all got along, and he said no. Angela always wanted things done her way, and George did what he wanted, and she didn't like it. So Bernard Brown, who testified yesterday, and we covered his testimony at the very beginning of this episode, he grew up with George's grandfather from childhood, and he was selling a truck. And so in 2013, the Wagners bought that truck and started hauling cattle. Bernie got them all of their loads to haul. And Billy and George hauled just the two of them for the first 3 months. And he said it was all day, every day work, nonstop from August to December hauling cattle because it was feeder season. So they'd go to the stockyard, get cattle, drop them off to the feeding grounds or whatever they call it. And he said he loved that job. He made it work with Billy because the money was good. So he said he would get $3.50 to $5 a mile, and they were running a minimum of 1,000 miles per trip. So after all the expenses were paid, they divided it 50-50. And he said they got along off and on throughout this time. There were no breaks. The reason Jake didn't work those first 3 months is because Hannah Mae was pregnant with Sophia, and he didn't want to leave until after the baby was born. They went all over the place. He named all the different states, and this was Wagner Trucking, and the business was in Billy's name. So after Sophia was born, Jake joined in, and they would trade weeks driving with Billy, one on, one off. When he stayed home, he would do the farm chores and spend time with Tabby and Vine, like hunting and fishing and doing things like that. The farm on Peterson was kind of the same as what they had on Bethel. He said Angela had a hobby farm obsession where she thought she made money, but really she got sunk in the hole, and Jake and George would have to pay for it. She had chickens, hogs, sheep, goats, rabbits, and George would get up and feed the animals, which would take about 45 minutes, and then he would spend the rest of the day with Vine and Tabby. He did have other chores, which were to make sure the sheep and pigs didn't get eaten, cleaning up their stalls and barns and all that stuff. Now, if he did it the way Angela was very particular about it, he said, like the pigs, she wanted each pig to have their food measured out and put in these neat little pans. So George said he would shortcut the work, cut the bag and drag it across the ground. He said her way would have taken 4 to 5 hours, but she wasn't doing it herself and she didn't like it, but kind of was what it was. Angela would scream at him it was her place, her business. She was paying the bills, which he said she wasn't. Me and Jake were. He said he reminded her of that all the time. So if their bills were $3,000, they would just split it in half and give her cash, and she would go pay with money orders. This went on the whole time they lived together, and he didn't find it unusual because it was just the way they always did things. And he was asking about the credit cards and if she had permission to use them. He said if she was ordering stuff for the kids, she had free reign of that credit card, and she did not need to ask him if she was getting things for Vine. So when him and Angela argued, George would get in his truck and go to the top of the hill. He said the whole farm was a hill, and that's why he didn't want it. But on Peterson, him and Tabitha and Angela would take care of Vine. He said most of the time it was him and Angela. He said Vine had a habit of getting hurt when she took care of him, when Tabby took care of him. If she gave him a bath, he would come out of the bath with a new knot on his head. And he recalled the one time that she shoved his hand in hot vegetables one time. He thinks she pushed him off the picnic table, but he said she could have been trying to catch him, but to him it looked like she pushed him. When asked if Tabby was abusing him, he said the only thing he can remember is the shoving the hand in the hot vegetables. He said Tess told him that Tabby was not capable of raising Vine on her own. As far as Angela's responsibilities with Vine, he said sometimes Vine would sleep with her, sometimes with him. It just depended on where he ended up that night. And when he was working, she watched him, and he literally called Angela a babysitter. He said, yeah, her role was like a babysitter. It was hilarious. I hope Angela's watching a live feed today. She might have just had a little fit in prison, y'all. She might have banged her heads on the bars. He's asked to describe the house on Peterson, and he does. And he said they brought a hunting cabin that he built with a friend named James and James's father. He actually brought that hunting cabin to Peterson Road from Bethel when they moved. He put it behind the white shed on Peterson. And he's asked about the property on Peterson on the opposite side of the road from their house. So there's 14 acres on that side. And they had a garage moved to Peterson that was on that side of the road, but there were no walls. So mainly they would work on cars over there. Eventually, Angela wanted a barn. So Jake George and Chris Newcomb started to build it. And she was going to put her exotic pigs in there. The defense asked if you could make good money doing that. And he said, if you did it right. He said, Frederica made great money selling those pigs, but Angela never did. He wasn't sure how much each pig sold for. He said he never paid attention. So they started the new barn in January of 2016, and it took about 6 months to finish. So it was done in June or July of 2016, just a few months after the murders. He had built barns before, 2 full-size like those and a 3-sided barn. He had built 2 of those on Bethel Hill, and one was for a friend. And then he's asked if he ever kind of ran away from Bethel Hill. And he said at 16, he was tired of dealing with Angela and Billy. So he filled his car up and drove 250 miles into Kentucky. But he knew if he kept going, he was going to run out of gas. And he had no money for gas. So he turned around and went back home. So he said another time in early 2014, Angela and Hannah Mae were having an argument and they drugged Tabby into it. He just didn't think it was right. So him and Angela got into a huge argument and he started to pack his bags to leave. Tabby came in, spent about an hour calming him down and talking him out of it. He said he didn't know where he was going to go. He was just tired of being with Angela. He said he would have a good day here and there, but she would just start stuff and yell and scream and act like everybody had to do what she said when she said it. And she always acted better than all of them. Another time he wanted to leave, he came in from work and Vine was sitting on the counter. And he said Vine was a couple of months old at this point, and Tabby was locked in the bathroom. So when he got the door open, he said he found Tabby in a pool of her own blood and she was trying to take her own life with a pair of scissors. So he took the scissors and bandaged up her wrists and he put her in the truck and tried to get her to go to the hospital, but she was terrified they were going to put her in a mental facility. He said he wanted to take her and Vine and just move away to Alaska. The defense asked if he had plans to move at that point, and he said yes, because Tabby said she couldn't deal with Angela anymore. But Tabitha ultimately told him they had no money, no way to get there, and they needed to stay where they had a home and a roof over their heads. So the defense asked if they had no money and no way to get there. So the defense asked, why didn't you ever leave? And George said he didn't want to be broke and homeless and never had the financial backing to actually leave. He said he regrets it. He said he wishes he had never turned around in Kentucky when he was 16 or any other time he left. Around this time, his relationship with Jake, right before Tabitha left him for good, they built a fence together, worked on a couple of trucks together, but either Jake was gone or George was. And they were more like associates and had nothing at all in common. He said anytime he did something he wanted to do, Jake would insult him or tell him that he was going to hell for it. He said nobody likes to be told their flaws on a daily basis. Angela told him this stuff too, but not as often as Jake. He said Jake did that to everyone he came in contact with, though. I can't stand people like Jake. He said ultimately him and Tabitha broke up because she was having one of her fits. We've talked extensively about that night that she left. He said Jake and Hannah Mae were in the living room and Tabby was in George's room changing Vine's diaper. Vine was screaming his head off, said George went in to see what was happening. And he said Tabby was just holding him down physically and Vine was kicking and screaming. So he told her to stop yelling at him, to go calm down, and he would change the diaper. So she got mad, tried to swing Vine around and bumped his head on the wall. He took Vine from Tabby and gave Vine to Hannah Mae. So Tabby got mad and stormed out to the patio. So George went out to calm her down. She was yelling and screaming, and then guess who pulls up? Angela. She put herself in the middle of the argument, George said, and George yelled and told her to go inside. George tried to hug Tabitha, and she bit him and hit him with a board, so he just went back inside. A couple of hours had passed, and she didn't come back, so Hannah Mae and Angela went to look for her, and they came back and said she was halfway to the truck stop. So George was going to go look for her, and Angela called out and said, Jake's coming with you. Tabitha wouldn't calm down, so George said since she had tried to kill herself before he called the sheriff's department for her well-being. He said the sheriff talked to both of them, and when asked if he wanted to press charges, he said no. That's what he said on the stand. Her mom and sister came to get her, and George went home and spent the next 3 days straight with Vine. That same night, Tabby put a letter in his mailbox, but it took him 3 days to find it. There was a lot of objections around this. His understanding of the letter was Tabitha saying she wanted Vine to live with him and she would live with her mom. And he called her and they decided they would try to fix things if they could get a place of their own. George said he tried for 6 weeks to fix things, but he found out she was still sleeping with her best friend's dad. So he went to her house in the middle of the night and told her he was done for good. After that, we know he files for divorce. He got an attorney, Barbara Moore, who testified last week, and he offered to get Tabby a divorce attorney, but she said she didn't need it since she was leaving Vine with him. Once the paperwork was finished, he picked Tabby up. They went to the lawyer's office and looked over it. And they had to take a parenting class together to help Vine cope with the separation. So he picked her up both times and said they sat together at that class. And the instructor made a remark that they were the only couple there who actually did that. After that, they had that court hearing and he picked her up for that as well. He said at this point, the relationship was normal at that point with Tabby. She came for Thanksgiving and Christmas that year, and she would come see Vine. He got supervised visits, according to him, because of the fits Tabby would have. Tabby has blow-up fits, and when she has those, she has a tendency to get violent. She doesn't pay attention to what she does when she's having the fits. And he didn't want Vine in the house where she was living because of what happened with Tabby and her sisters, and the fact that Tabby's mom allowed it to happen. And George looks at the jury during this, y'all. I thought he was going to cry. So I really did. He got very emotional recalling this. He said from the time Tabby was little, Tabby's mom would hold her down while her stepfather assaulted her. And this was the couple of times George looked over at the jury and made eye contact, to me, it looked like. After the divorce, George said Tabby came to see Vine many times. She brought her boyfriend, who George didn't want there since he was who she cheated with, and George just didn't want him around Vine. He said her sisters were of the same opinion of it's life, the kid will get over it, and he didn't elaborate on what he meant by saying that. I'm thinking maybe in the possibility, I'm just speculating here, but the way I took it was sort of if the same thing happened to Vine, that's life, the kid will get over it. So he said he worried about Vine's safety. And Tabby was going to take him back to court, and he about started crying with this one too, I think. He was notified of this right before his arrest. The hearing was actually scheduled for 3 weeks after his arrest, but as we know, it didn't happen. And Tabby has full custody of Vine, and I've seen some online stuff with Tabby. One of the groups that follows this case on Facebook all chipped in and bought her a Walmart gift card. And so she had like a scrub uniform on, looks like maybe she's working in the nursing field, and was holding up that Walmart gift card. So that was the first half before lunch. I still have to watch after lunch, make notes. So I'm hoping to have this episode out before 10 o'clock. But I wanted to put this out to give you something to chew on, something to think about. I thought it was pretty compelling testimony. Just to hear him, he did not sound the way I expected him to sound. Of course, we've heard him hitting the high notes with his yelling and the wiretaps, which were not pleasant to listen to, but a much more subdued George than we've heard so far. And in my opinion, I do think this part of the testimony was believable and credible. He didn't hesitate in his answers. He kept eye contact. He didn't. I think he gave appropriate emotions to where it seems like from what I've heard, Jake did not, gave inappropriate emotions, although I have peeked and it looks like he is going with his I knew nothing defense, which, I got oceanfront property in Arizona for you too. But anyway, so I'm going to hop on this second part. I'll bring it to you later tonight. By the way, I'm hoping to have my store back up and running tomorrow. We're going to run a sale. Let you start getting some early Christmas stuff. I got some cool shirts made. I'll show them to you on the next episode. I'm going to dig into this next one. We will see you in a bit, y'all.